Poor female mechanic fixes a stranger's car for free, not knowing he is a millionaire. The next day, men in suits in luxury cars park at her house. The autumn rain pattered against the worn metal roof of Riley's Auto Repair, a small shop nestled on the outskirts of Millfield, Pennsylvania. Sarah Riley wiped the sweat from her brow, leaving a smudge of grease across her forehead as she finished her work on Mrs. Henderson's ancient station wagon. The clock on the wall read 6:30 p.m., well past closing time, but Sarah never turned away anyone who needed help, especially not a 70-year-old widow who relied on her car to visit her grandchildren every weekend. "All done, Mrs. Henderson?" Sarah called out, closing the hood with practiced ease. "Changed your oil and fixed that rattling noise. Should run smooth as butter now." The elderly woman smiled gratefully, reaching for her purse. "How much do I owe you, dear?" Sarah waved, her hand dismissively. "Just the cost of the oil this time. Dad always said to take care of the regulars." Mrs. Henderson's eyes softened at the mention of Tom Riley, Sarah's father, who had passed away exactly 1 year ago today. "He was a good man, your father. This town hasn't been the same without him." Sarah swallowed hard, fighting back the familiar sting of tears. "No, it hasn't." After Mrs. Henderson left, Sarah began cleaning up the shop, her mind wandering to the stack of unpaid bills on her desk. The property taxes were due next week, and the bank had sent another letter about the mortgage. The shop had been struggling ever since her father got sick 3 years ago. Medical bills had drained their savings, and despite Sarah's best efforts, keeping the business afloat was becoming increasingly difficult. She was about to lock up when she heard the distinctive sound of an engine sputtering, followed by silence, then the crunch of tires on gravel as a vehicle coasted to a stop outside. Sarah sighed, her shoulders slumping with exhaustion, but she squared them again quickly. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. "Never turn away. Someone who needs help, Sarah Bear. You never know what difference you might make." Opening the garage door, she spotted a mid-2000s sedan with faded blue paint and rust spots along the wheel wells. A man in his late 40s emerged from the driver's side, his clothes rumpled and his expression harried. Unlike most of her customers, he wasn't from Millfield. Sarah knew everyone in the small town of 5,000 people. "Excuse me?" the man called, running a hand through his thinning hair. "I don't suppose you're still open? My car just died and I have a meeting I absolutely cannot miss tomorrow morning in Pittsburgh." Sarah glanced at the clock again, then back at the stranger. She should say no. She was tired and tomorrow would be another long day of barely making ends meet. But something in the man's desperate expression reminded her of her father. The same weathered lines around the eyes, the same humble demeanor. "Bring it in," she said, rolling up her sleeves. "Let's take a look." The man introduced himself simply as Jack, offering no last name as he explained his situation. "I was trying to save on hotel costs by driving through the night," he admitted sheepishly. "Not my best plan, apparently." Sarah got to work, diagnosing a failing alternator and several other issues that had been neglected for too long. As she worked, she found herself sharing stories about her father and the shop. "Today's his anniversary," she explained, not looking up from the engine. 1 year since we lost him. He always said that helping others on hard days helps heal your own heart. 3 hours later, with grease up to her elbows and sweat dampening her t-shirt, Sarah closed the hood. "That should get you to Pittsburgh and back," she said, wiping her hands on a rag. "Changed your oil while I was at it and fixed that brake line that was about to go. Would have left you stranded for real if it had given out on the highway." Jack looked stunned. I don't know what to say. How much do I owe you?" Sarah hesitated. The parts alone had cost nearly $200, money she desperately needed, but something inside wouldn't let her charge this man who reminded her so much of her father. "It's on the house," she said finally. "Dad's anniversary gift to a stranger in need." Jack's eyes widened. "I can't accept that. I know parts and labor." "You can," Sarah interrupted firmly. "Just pay it forward someday, okay?" After a moment of stunned silence, Jack nodded, visibly moved. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a plain business card with just a phone number printed on it. "If you ever need anything at all, call this number." Sarah accepted the card with a polite smile, tucking it into her jeans pocket without really looking at it. They exchanged goodbyes, and Jack drove away with profuse thanks, the sedan running smoothly now. As she locked up the shop for the night, Sarah felt that familiar mix of pride and grief that always accompanied thoughts of her father. She had honored his memory today, even if it meant tomorrow's financial struggles would be that much harder. The small apartment above the garage was quiet and cold when she entered. She hadn't bothered turning on the heat yet this season, another expense she couldn't afford. Pulling her father's old flannel robe around her shoulders, Sarah settled at the kitchen table with a cup of instant coffee and the pile of bills. Her hands trembled slightly as she sorted through them. Final notices, payment past due, threat of service disconnection. A lump formed in her throat as she calculated the figures again. Even if every customer paid their outstanding balances, tomorrow, which they wouldn't, she'd still be short on the mortgage payment. In 3 months, maybe less, she'd lose the shop. Her father's legacy, the only home she'd ever known, would be gone. Sarah let a single tear fall onto the disconnection notice from the electric company before wiping her eyes roughly with her sleeve. Self-pity wouldn't save Riley's auto repair. Tomorrow she'd call some of her regulars with outstanding balances, maybe see if Joe at the parts warehouse would extend her credit again. She fell asleep that night on the couch, surrounded by bills and her father's old repair manuals, the stranger's business card forgotten in her pocket. Had she looked more closely, she might have noticed the fine watermarked text that would have identified Jack Sullivan, CEO of Summit Hotels International and one of the wealthiest businessmen in America. But Sarah Riley fell into an exhausted sleep, unaware that her simple act of kindness was about to change her life forever. Sarah awoke to the sound of a vehicle pulling up outside the shop. Disoriented, she glanced at her watch, 6:45 a.m., earlier than any customer had ever arrived. Peering through the faded curtains of her apartment window, she saw not one, but 3 black SUVs with tinted windows parked in front of Riley's auto repair. "What the hell?" she muttered, hastily pulling on jeans and a clean shirt. By the time she made it downstairs, 3 men in impeccably tailored suits stood at the shop's entrance. The tallest of them, a serious-looking man with salt and pepper hair, stepped forward. "Ms. Sarah Riley?" he asked formally. Sarah's hand instinctively reached for the wrench she kept by the door. "Who's asking?" "My name is Robert Chen, Chief of Staff for Mr. Jack Sullivan." When Sarah's expression remained blank, he continued, "The gentleman whose car you repaired last night." "Jack Sullivan," Sarah repeated, the name finally registering. "Wait, not the Jack Sullivan who owns Summit Hotels International, among other ventures," Robert confirmed with a nod. "Mr. Sullivan would like to speak with you personally. He's asked us to bring you to meet him if you're available." Sarah looked down at her worn jeans and faded Millfield High t-shirt, then at the 3 luxury vehicles and the men in suits, probably worth more than her monthly income. "This is some kind of joke, right? Did Mike from the diner put you up to this?" Robert's expression didn't change. "No joke, Ms. Riley. Mr. Sullivan was deeply impressed by your generosity last night. He'd like to discuss a business proposition with you." "A business proposition?" Sarah echoed skeptically. "Look, I appreciate the offer, but I have appointments today. Customers counting on me." Robert pulled out a sleek smartphone. "If you'll provide their information, we can reschedule your appointments and arrange compensation for their inconvenience." Sarah's mind raced. If this wasn't a prank, refusing to meet one of the wealthiest men in America would be insane, especially when Riley's auto repair was weeks away from bankruptcy. But the whole situation felt surreal. "I need to make the calls myself," she insisted, maintaining some control over the bizarre situation. 30 minutes later, after changing into the nicest outfit she owned, black pants and a button-down shirt she usually reserved for bank meetings, Sarah found herself in the back seat of a luxury SUV headed toward Pittsburgh. "Mr. Sullivan is staying at the Ellsworth," Robert explained as they drove. "He has a private dining room reserved for your meeting." The Ellsworth was Pittsburgh's most exclusive hotel, a place Sarah had only seen in magazine features about celebrity visits to the city. As they pulled up to the entrance, she fought the urge to shrink into the leather seat. "Just be yourself, Ms. Riley," Robert said, noticing her discomfort. That's precisely what impressed Mr. Sullivan. The hotel lobby gleamed with marble and crystal, making Sarah acutely aware of her scuffed boots and calloused hands. Staff members nodded respectfully to Robert as he led her to a private elevator. On the top floor, they entered a dining room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Pittsburgh's skyline. Jack Sullivan stood as they entered, and Sarah was struck by the transformation. Gone was the rumpled, ordinary-looking man from last night. In his place stood a commanding figure in a bespoke suit, his posture radiating quiet confidence. "Ms. Riley," he greeted warmly, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." Sarah shook his hand firmly, the way her father had taught her. "Mr. Sullivan, you clean up nice for a guy with a busted alternator." He laughed genuinely. "Please call me Jack, and I owe you an explanation. My car breaking down wasn't planned, but it happened at an interesting time. Over a breakfast more, elaborate than any Sarah had ever seen, Jack explained that he had been returning from a series of meetings with potential business partners. "I've been developing a new concept for Summit, boutique auto service centers attached to our hotels, catering to business travelers," he explained. "I was evaluating partners all week and frankly, I was disappointed by all of them. Too focused on profit margins, not enough on actual service." Sarah listened, picking at her omelette. "So your car conveniently broke down in front of my shop." "As I said, that part wasn't planned," Jack smiled. "But when it happened, I decided to see how a small-town mechanic would treat a seemingly ordinary customer with an emergency. A sort of unplanned character test, if you will." Sarah set down her fork. "So you could have paid for those repairs." "I could have bought the entire shop on the spot," Jack acknowledged. "That's not the point. In a world where everything has a price tag, your generosity had no hidden agenda. You didn't know who I was. You helped me because it was your father's anniversary, and it honored his memory to help someone in need." His expression grew serious. "That kind of integrity is rare, Ms. Riley. Extremely rare." "Sarah," she corrected automatically. "Sarah," he nodded. "I have a proposition for you. I want to invest in Riley's auto repair." Sarah nearly choked on her coffee. "What?" "I've had my team conduct some preliminary research overnight," Jack continued, sliding a folder across the table. "Your shop has a stellar reputation locally, but it's struggling financially. The building needs updates, your equipment is outdated, and you're carrying debt from your father's medical expenses." Sarah's cheeks burned with embarrassment as this stranger laid bare her financial struggles. "I'm proposing a partnership," Jack continued. "I'll provide capital to modernize your shop, clear the debt, and expand your services. In return, Riley's becomes the prototype for my new concept, a place where exceptional service and integrity are the foundation." "And what happens to me in this arrangement?" Sarah asked cautiously. "You remain in charge," Jack said firmly. "You continue running the business your way, with your values. My investment comes with resources and opportunities, not control." Sarah's mind whirled with possibilities. No more sleepless nights over bills. New equipment that wouldn't break down weekly. Maybe even hiring help so she could occasionally take a day off. But doubt crept in. "Why me? Why not buy out some failing chain and revamp it?" "Because you can't manufacture authenticity," Jack replied. "What your father built, what you're preserving, that genuine care for customers and community can't be faked. Trust me, I've seen corporations try." He named a figure for his initial investment that made Sarah's eyes widen. "Take some time to think about it," Jack offered, seeing her overwhelmed expression. "My team will provide you with all the details to review. No pressure." Sarah looked out at the Pittsburgh skyline, then back at Jack Sullivan. "My dad used to say that luck is when preparation meets opportunity. I'm not prepared for this kind of opportunity, Mr. Sullivan." "Jack," he reminded her gently, "and maybe this is exactly the opportunity you've been preparing for your whole life, without knowing it." Later that afternoon, back in Millfield, Sarah stood in the center of Riley's auto repair, seeing it through new eyes. The worn concrete floor with oil stains that never quite came out, the vintage tools her grandfather had used still hanging on the pegboard. The faded sign outside with the shop's motto, "We fix more than cars." Her phone buzzed with a text from Robert Chen. "Documents sent to your email for review. Mr. Sullivan hopes to hear from you within the week." Sarah sat on her father's old stool, running her fingers along the edge of the workbench where he had taught her to rebuild her first engine at age 12. What would Tom Riley think of Jack Sullivan's offer? Would he see it as selling out or as saving his legacy? As evening fell, customers began stopping by, not for repairs, but because word had spread about Sarah's mysterious departure with men in suits. In a town like Millfield, such events never went unnoticed. "Heard you got picked up by some fancy types this morning," said Bill Parker, the town's barber, leaning against the shop entrance. "Everything okay, Sarah?" Before she could answer, Martha from the diner chimed in. "Someone said it was government men. You in some kind of trouble, honey?" Sarah sighed, knowing there would be no keeping secrets in Millfield. Not government. A businessman wants to invest in the shop. The small crowd that had gathered exchanged glances. "What kind of businessman drives out to Millfield looking for auto shops to invest in?" asked Fred Johnson, the hardware store owner, skepticism evident in his voice. "The kind whose car broke. Down here last night," Sarah replied, deciding simplicity was best. As the impromptu gathering dispersed, Sarah could already sense the rumors beginning to form. By morning, half the town would believe she was selling the shop, and the other half would suspect something more scandalous. Alone again, Sarah opened her email to find not only detailed investment proposals, but also background information on Jack Sullivan and Summit Hotels International. As she read through the materials, one thing became increasingly clear. This was no impulse offer. Jack Sullivan was serious and the opportunity was real. Her finger hovered over her phone, the business card with Jack's direct number sitting beside it. One call could change everything. But was she ready for what that change might bring? 6. Months had transformed Riley's auto repair beyond recognition. The worn concrete floor was now polished and epoxied to a professional shine. State-of-the-art diagnostic equipment lined the walls where outdated tools once hung. The waiting area, previously consisting of 2 mismatched chairs and a coffee maker that worked half the time, now featured comfortable seating, complimentary beverages and high-speed Wi-Fi for customers. Sarah stood in the center of it all, still sometimes feeling like a stranger in her own shop. "The new hydraulic lifts are being installed next Tuesday," said Marcus Webb, the project manager Jack. Sullivan had assigned to oversee the renovation, "and the solar panels should be operational by the end of the month. You'll be the greenest auto shop in 3 counties." Sarah nodded, reviewing the schedules on the tablet she now carried everywhere. She'd hired 3 additional mechanics, all locals who needed jobs, and a receptionist. For the first time since her father fell ill, the business was not just surviving but thriving. "Mr. Sullivan's son will be visiting next week," Marcus added casually. "He wants to see our progress firsthand." Sarah looked up sharply. Jack didn't mention his son was involved. "Technically he isn't," Marcus replied, "but Ryan Sullivan has been showing more interest in his father's investments lately, especially this one." Something in Marcus's tone made Sarah uneasy. "What's he like?" "Ryan?" Marcus hesitated. "Let's just say he and his father have different business philosophies." Before Sarah could press further, the bell over the door chimed, and Mike Donovan, Millfield's town sheriff and Sarah's childhood friend, walked in. "Fancy place you got." "Here now, Riley," he said, looking around with a deliberately neutral expression. Almost didn't recognize it. "Mike," Sarah greeted him, sensing the undercurrent in his words. "What brings you by? Your cruiser giving you trouble again?" "Nah, running fine after that last tune-up." He glanced pointedly at Marcus, who took the hint and excused himself. "Actually came by to see how you're doing with all this change." Sarah led him to the new coffee station, grateful for a friendly face despite his obvious reservations. "It's a lot to take in," she admitted, "but the shop was dying, Mike. You know that better than anyone." Mike had been there through Tom Riley's illness, had seen Sarah's struggle to keep the business afloat while caring for her father. He'd even loaned her money once or twice, which she'd always repaid promptly. "People are talking, Sarah," he he said, lowering his voice. Not everyone's happy about outside money coming in, changing things. Sarah's back stiffened. The only thing that's changed is that we can now serve more customers, employ more locals, and I don't have to choose between paying the electricity or the property tax. I know, Mike held up his hands. I'm just the messenger. But some folks are wondering if this big city investor has ulterior motives. Millfield's prime for development now that the new highway connection is approved. Property values are rising. The implication was clear. People suspected Jack Sullivan was using Sarah to get a foothold in Millfield for larger development plans. Jack isn't like that, Sarah insisted, though a flicker of doubt crept in. She'd known the man for all of 6 months, after all. Besides, I maintain controlling interest in the business. That was non-negotiable. Mike nodded, seeming relieved. Good, just keep your eyes open, okay? These corporate types, they play a different game. After Mike left, Sarah found herself staring at the newly redesigned logo on the wall, Riley's Automotive Center, it now read, with a sleek modern font but still incorporating the wrench and heart insignia her father had designed 30 years ago. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jack. Quarterly reviews look excellent. Congratulations, Sarah. You've exceeded all projections. Dinner when I'm in town next week? Sarah smiled, typing back a quick affirmative. Jack had become more than just an investor. He'd become a mentor and friend, guiding her through the unfamiliar terrain of business expansion while respecting her expertise in automotive repair. That evening, Sarah attended Millfield's Spring Festival, an annual tradition where the entire town gathered in the central square for food, music, and community celebration. In previous years, Riley's Auto Repair had sponsored the Children's Bicycle Decorating Contest, with Sarah volunteering to judge and hand out modest prizes. This year, Riley's Automotive Center was the event's main sponsor, funding not just the bicycle contest, but also live music, additional food vendors, and commemorative t-shirts for all attendees. As Sarah moved through the crowd, she noticed the mixed reactions. Some people, particularly those she'd hired or whose families had benefited from the shop's expansion, greeted her warmly. Others, especially older residents who'd known her father, gave her polite but distant nods. Sarah Riley, the hometown. Girl made good, called out Diane Fletcher, the high school principal, approaching with a glass of punch. The festivals never looked better thanks to your generosity. It's the least we could do, Sarah replied, emphasizing the we to include her father's legacy. I hear you're hiring interns from the high school's vocational program, Diane continued. That's a wonderful opportunity for our students. Sarah brightened. Yes, it was Jack's idea, actually. We're starting with 3 positions this summer, teaching basic automotive maintenance and repair. If it goes well, we might expand it into a full apprenticeship program. Jack, is it? Came a voice from behind them. Martha from the diner stood there, arms crossed. Sounds like you and this investor of yours have gotten quite close. The implication in her tone made Sarah flush. It's a professional relationship, Martha. Martha raised an eyebrow. Well, professional or not, people wonder what a big shot hotel magnate wants with our little town. Nobody gets rich by being charitable, honey. Before Sarah could respond, the festival's MC announced the start of the bicycle contest, calling for Sarah to come judge. Grateful for the interruption, she excused herself, but Martha's words lingered. The next morning brought a new challenge. A shipment of parts Sarah had ordered for the Johnsons' restoration project, a 1967 Mustang they were refurbishing for their son's graduation, failed to arrive. When she called the supplier, a company she'd worked with for years, the answer was unexpected. I'm sorry, Ms. Riley, but your account has been flagged, the representative said hesitantly. We've been instructed not to fulfill your orders. Instructed by whom? Sarah demanded. I'm not at liberty to say, but it comes from higher management, something about competitive conflicts. After 3 more calls to different suppliers yielded similar results, Sarah understood what was happening. Motorworks, a regional chain of auto service centers with locations in neighboring counties, was pressuring suppliers. Riley's expansion was cutting into their territory, and they were fighting back. Sarah was contemplating her next move when her phone rang with an unknown number. "Is this Sarah Riley?" asked a crisp female voice. "Yes. Who's this?" "Diana Patel, VP of Operations at Motorworks. I understand you've been having supply chain issues. Such a shame." Sarah's grip tightened on her phone. "So you're behind this?" "Business is business, Ms. Riley," Diana replied coolly. "You were a quaint local shop that posed no threat. Now, with Sullivan money behind you, you're expanding into our market. We're simply protecting our interests. By strong-arming suppliers, that's borderline illegal." "Prove it," Diana challenged. "In the meantime, I have an alternative proposal. Motorworks would be interested in acquiring Riley's. We'd keep you on as manager, of course. Consider it a solution to your supply problem." Sarah ended the call without responding, her mind racing. This wasn't just about parts for one restoration project. Without reliable suppliers, the entire business was at risk. She was still processing this threat when Jack called. After explaining the situation, she expected legal threats, corporate maneuvering, the kind of high-level business tactics someone of Jack's stature would employ. Instead, his response surprised her. "This is a perfect opportunity, Sarah." "For what? Being bullied out of business?" "For innovation," Jack replied enthusiastically. "Why fight for space in their supply chain when you can create your own? I've been looking into vertical integration opportunities, and this pushes the timeline forward." By that evening, Jack had arranged for alternative suppliers from Pittsburgh to deliver the parts Riley's needed immediately. He'd also set in motion plans for a small parts manufacturing operation that could serve not just Riley's, but other independent shops facing similar pressure from large chains. As Sarah reviewed the proposal he sent over, her phone buzzed with another text. "By the way, I've moved my visit up. Arriving tomorrow with Ryan. This situation requires personal attention." Sarah looked around her apartment above the shop, now renovated with Jack's investment, but still modest by his standards, and wondered what Jack Sullivan's son would make of Millfield, of Riley's, of her. More importantly, she wondered what his sudden interest in his father's investment might mean for the future she was just beginning to rebuild. Outside her window, the lights of Millfield's main street twinkled in the spring evening. The town had been her entire world for 28 years. Now that world was expanding in ways both exhilarating and terrifying. As much as she embraced the opportunities Jack Sullivan had brought into her life, a part of her wondered what her father would think of the path she was taking and where it might ultimately lead. The sleek black Bentley seemed almost comically out of place on Millfield's main street, drawing stares from passers-by as it pulled up in front of Riley's automotive center. Sarah, who had been nervously straightening the already immaculate reception area, took a deep breath before stepping outside to greet her visitors. Jack Sullivan emerged first, dressed casually in slacks and a button-down shirt, his concession to the small-town setting. He greeted Sarah with a warm handshake and genuine smile that had become familiar over the past months. "Sarah, you've outdone yourself," he said, admiring the renovated facade. "The place looks fantastic." Before she could respond, the Bentley's other door opened and Ryan Sullivan stepped out. At 32, the younger Sullivan had his father's height and bearing, but none of his warmth. His designer suit probably cost more than most Millfield residents earned in a month, and his expression as he surveyed the auto shop and the surrounding town made it clear he wasn't impressed. "So this is the famous Riley's," Ryan said, not bothering to hide his disdain. "Charming, I suppose, in a rustic way." Jack shot his son a warning look before turning back to Sarah. "Ryan's joining us to learn more about our community-based business model. He's been handling our luxury brands exclusively until now." "Exclusively and successfully," Ryan added pointedly. "The Monaco property just received its 5th star." Sarah extended her hand. "Welcome to Millfield, Ryan. I hope you'll find something worth your while here, despite our lack of stars." Ryan's handshake was perfunctory. "I'm sure it will be educational." The tour of the facility went smoothly enough, with Jack asking insightful questions about the new equipment and services, while Ryan remained largely silent, occasionally tapping notes into his smartphone. It wasn't until they reached the back office that the younger Sullivan finally showed interest. "These projections are impressive," he said, reviewing the quarterly reports displayed on Sarah's computer. "You've increased revenue by 42% while maintaining nearly the same margin percentages. How?" Sarah explained her approach, modernizing equipment to increase efficiency while maintaining her father's commitment to fair pricing and exceptional service. "We don't upsell unnecessarily or inflate labor costs," she concluded. "Word travels fast in a small town. Trust is our most valuable asset." "Trust doesn't pay dividends," Ryan remarked. "Actually, it does," Jack countered. "Repeat business, referrals, community goodwill, these translate directly to sustainable revenue. That's the foundation of this model." Ryan's response was interrupted by a commotion in the service bay. One of the new mechanics, Danny Miller, a Millfield native Sarah had hired right out of technical school, was arguing with a customer. "I don't care what your computer says," the customer, an elderly man Sarah recognized as Mr. Peterson, was saying loudly. "Tom Riley always charged me a flat rate for tune-ups, and his daughter should honor that." Sarah excused herself and approached the escalating situation. "Mr. Peterson, is there a problem?" The old farmer turned to her, face flushed with anger. "This young fella says my tune-up is going to cost nearly double what your daddy used to charge. Says it's the new computerized pricing system, or some nonsense. Your father would never—" "Mr. Peterson," Sarah interrupted gently. "You're absolutely right. Dad had a standing arrangement with you and several other farmers. Danny's new and wouldn't know about that." She turned to the young mechanic. "The Peterson farm supplies all our pumpkins at Halloween and corn for the Thanksgiving food drive. They get the legacy rate on basic services." Danny looked confused but nodded. "Sorry, Ms. Riley. The system wouldn't let me override the price without manager approval." Sarah quickly adjusted the bill in the system, aware of Ryan Sullivan watching the interaction with narrowed eyes. After Mr. Peterson left, apparently satisfied, Ryan approached her. "You just sacrifice profit margin for sentiment," he said. "That's not sustainable business practice." "It's not sentiment. It's relationship maintenance," Sarah replied firmly. "Mr. Peterson will tell every farmer in the county about this interaction. The goodwill is worth far more than the $30 we didn't charge." Ryan seemed unconvinced, but Jack was nodding approvingly. "This is exactly why Riley's is the perfect prototype," he told his son. "They understand the mechanics of community commerce, not just the mechanics of automobiles." Later, over lunch at Millfield's only upscale restaurant, a farm-to-table establishment that had opened the previous year, Jack laid out his expanded vision. "The motorwork situation has accelerated our timeline," he explained. "But it's a blessing in disguise. I'm proposing we establish not just a parts supply chain, but a technical training center right here in Millfield." Sarah nearly choked on her water. "A training center?" "Vocational education is a growing market," Jack continued enthusiastically. "Young people are seeking alternatives to expensive 4-year degrees. We can offer certified training programs in automotive technology, building on your internship idea, but expanding it significantly." "The property adjacent to Riley's is available," he added. "I've had my team look into zoning requirements for a technical school facility." Sarah's mind raced with possibilities. A training center would create more jobs, provide opportunities for local youth, and further cement Riley's place in the community. But the scale of Jack's vision was dizzying. "This is becoming much bigger than fixing cars," she said quietly. Jack smiled kindly. "It always was, Sarah. From the moment you fixed my car for free on your father's anniversary, this was about more than automotive repair. It was about values, community, legacy." Ryan, who had been silently observing the exchange, finally spoke up. "Let's be realistic about what we're building here. The auto service component is fine as a local goodwill generator, but the real value is in the Sullivan brand expansion into new markets. Once we establish the training center concept, we can replicate it nationally." The way he said it sent a chill through Sarah. There was something calculating in his tone that contrasted sharply with Jack's genuine enthusiasm. "What exactly do you mean by that?" she asked carefully. Ryan smiled thinly. "Eventually, we transition from Riley's Automotive Center to Sullivan Automotive Academy. We maintain the hometown charm aesthetic, but with standardized processes and unified branding across all locations. The Riley name might remain in Millfield as a nod to heritage, but nationally it's all Sullivan. Sarah's eyes darted to Jack, who looked uncomfortable. That's premature, Ryan. We haven't discussed any name changes or national branding strategies. Riley's identity and Sarah's leadership are central to our concept. For the prototype, sure, Ryan conceded smoothly. But scale requires uniformity. Sentiment doesn't translate to shareholder value. The lunch concluded with a tension that hadn't been there before. As they walked back to Riley's, Jack pulled Sarah aside, allowing Ryan to walk ahead. "I apologize for my son," he said quietly. Ryan sees everything through the lens of corporate expansion. He doesn't understand yet what makes this partnership special. Sarah nodded, but doubt had taken root. Is he wrong, though? Is this all just a prototype that eventually gets absorbed into the Sullivan empire? Not if I have anything to say about it, Jack assured her. This partnership works because we respect each other's values and vision. That doesn't change. Back at the shop, Sarah was introducing Ryan to her senior mechanic when Marcus Webb, the project manager, approached with an urgent expression. "Ms. Riley, there's a situation with the financials I need to discuss," he said, glancing meaningfully at the Sullivans. "In private, if possible." Sarah excused herself and followed Marcus to her office, where he closed the door before speaking. "I've found some irregularities in the renovation expenses," he said without preamble, pulling up spreadsheets on her computer. "Several large payments to vendors we've never used, all approved by Eric Lambert, one of the financial advisors on Mr. Sullivan's team." Sarah studied the numbers, frowning. "What are these for? We never ordered marble countertops or premium sound systems." "Exactly," Marcus said grimly. "And there's more. Lambert has been systematically inflating costs and diverting funds. I'd estimate nearly $200,000 has been misappropriated so far." Sarah's stomach dropped. "Does Jack know?" "I don't think so. Lambert reports directly to Ryan." The implication hung in the air between them. Sarah's mind raced with contradicting thoughts. Was this simply embezzlement by a corrupt employee? Or was Ryan Sullivan knowingly allowing funds to be diverted, perhaps to undermine the project's viability? "I need to tell Jack," Sarah said firmly. "Be careful," Marcus warned. "Lambert has connections throughout the organization, and if Ryan is involved..." Sarah nodded, understanding the complexity of the situation. This wasn't just about money. It was about trust, about the entire foundation of her partnership with Jack Sullivan. That evening, after the Sullivans had returned to their hotel in Pittsburgh, Sarah sat alone in her father's old chair in the corner of the shop, the financial records spread before her. Everything she and Jack had built over the past 6 months suddenly felt precarious. Her phone rang. Mike Donovan, the sheriff. "Sarah, you need to be aware of something," he said without preliminaries. "There's a rumor circulating that Sullivan plans to buy up significant portions of downtown Millfield. Some kind of resort development. People are saying your shop was just the first step." Sarah's grip tightened on the phone. Where did this come from? "Ryan Sullivan had drinks with Mayor Wilson at the Creekside Bar after you all had lunch. Several people overheard them discussing property valuations and zoning changes. Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place, and Sarah felt a cold anger rising. Ryan wasn't just dismissive of Riley's. He was actively undermining her partnership with Jack, perhaps setting the stage for a very different kind of development in Millfield. The question was whether Jack knew, and if he didn't, how he would respond when she told him. Before she could decide on her next move, a text arrived from Jack. "Meet for breakfast tomorrow? 8 a.m. at your place. Just us. Important matters to discuss." Sarah replied with a simple yes, her mind already formulating what she would say. This confrontation would determine not just the future of Riley's automotive center, but possibly the future of Millfield itself, and whether the trust she had placed in Jack Sullivan had been misguided all along. Sarah barely slept that night, rehearsing what she would say to Jack, alternating between anger at the possible betrayal and hope that there was an explanation that would preserve their partnership and her faith in him. She arrived at the shop an hour early, brewing real coffee instead of the instant variety she usually made for herself. At precisely 8 a.m., Jack's car pulled up. Not the ostentatious Bentley from yesterday, but the modest sedan she'd repaired a year ago. The symbolism wasn't lost on her. Jack entered alone, his expression serious but warm. Before he could speak, Sarah placed the financial documents on the table between them. "We need to talk about Eric Lambert and where $200,000 of the renovation budget has gone," she said directly. "And then we need to discuss why your son was talking to our mayor about buying up downtown Millfield for a resort development." Jack's face registered genuine shock, then understanding, followed by a deep weariness that made him suddenly look his age. "Sarah, I owe you an explanation," he said, sitting down and gesturing for her to do the same. "But it's not what you think. May I?" He motioned to the documents. For the next 20 minutes, Jack explained that he had discovered Lambert's embezzlement scheme 2 weeks earlier. "I've been building a case quietly with our internal auditors. I didn't tell you because I wanted concrete evidence before making accusations." He pulled out his tablet and showed Sarah emails documenting his investigation. Lambert was operating independently, though he tried to implicate Ryan when we caught him. He's been terminated and we'll be pressing charges. The diverted funds will be recovered through insurance and personally reimbursed by me in the meantime. Sarah felt some of the tension leave her shoulders, but not all. And the resort development? Mike heard Ryan discussing it with Mayor Wilson last night. Jack's expression darkened. "That's a more complicated situation. Ryan has been pushing an alternative vision for Millfield, a luxury resort community that would essentially transform the town. He's been exploring it behind my back, trying to build local political support before presenting it as a fait accompli." "So you didn't know?" Sarah pressed. "Not the extent of it, no." Jack met her eyes directly. "Ryan sees Millfield's relatively low property values and prime location as an opportunity for development. What he fails to understand is that I invested in Riley's precisely because I wanted to preserve communities like this, not transform them into playgrounds for the wealthy." Sarah studied his face, searching for any sign of deception. "Why should I believe you?" Jack reached into his jacket and pulled out a legal document. "Because I came here today to give you this, before I knew about any of these revelations." Sarah took the document and read the title, Transfer of Ownership Interest, Riley's Automotive Center and Sullivan Technical Training Institute. "I'm transferring controlling interest in both Riley's and the proposed training center to a community trust," Jack explained. "You'll be the primary trustee, with a board consisting of yourself and 4 community members of your choosing. My financial stake remains, but governance transfers to local control." Sarah stared at the document in disbelief. "Why would you do this?" "Because I've spent my career building hotels that cater to people passing through. Places with no permanence, no real community," Jack said quietly. "What you have here, what your father built, is the opposite. It's rooted, connected, meaningful. I don't want to change that, I want to support it. And frankly, I don't trust my own organization to maintain that vision without legal protections in place." Sarah felt tears threatening. "This is what you came to tell me, before you knew about Lambert or Ryan's machinations?" Jack nodded. "This partnership was never meant to be a corporate takeover, Sarah. It was meant to be a bridge between 2 worlds, my resources and your values. The trust ensures that bridge remains intact, regardless of what happens to me or Summit Hotels." Their conversation was interrupted by the unmistakable sound of Ryan Sullivan's voice in the outer office, followed by Marcus Webb's attempts to delay him. A moment later, the office door opened and Ryan entered, his expression thunderous, when he saw the papers on the desk. "So this is why you wanted to meet her alone," he said to his father, "to cut this ridiculous deal behind my back." Jack stood, his demeanor shifting from the warmth he'd shown Sarah to something harder and more formal. "Ryan, I was planning to discuss this with you after finalizing the arrangement." "Discuss? There's nothing to discuss," Ryan snapped. "You're giving away valuable company assets to satisfy some sentimental attachment to a small-town mechanic and a business model with limited scalability." Ryan, Jack began, but his son cut him off. Do you have any idea what Millfield could become? The property values alone, once properly developed, could yield returns 10 times higher than this apprenticeship program you're so fixated on. Sarah stood slowly. Millfield isn't a development opportunity, Ryan. It's a community of people who have built their lives here for generations. Ryan barely glanced at her. Every community evolves. The smart ones capitalize on it. Enough, Jack said firmly. Ryan, my decision is final. The trust will be established and Sarah will have controlling interest moving forward. The board won't approve this, Ryan threatened. I've already spoken with Thompson and Rivera. They have concerns about the direction of these community investments. The board approved my discretionary investment fund precisely so I could pursue projects like this without committee oversight, Jack replied calmly. And as for Thompson and Rivera, they've already signed off on the trust structure. I met with them last week. The color drained from Ryan's face. You went around me, your own son. I went through proper channels for a project you were actively trying to undermine, Jack corrected. There's a difference. The confrontation might have escalated further had Danny not burst into the office looking panicked. Miss Riley, the Wilsons just called. There's water everywhere in their basement. Their pump failed, and with all this spring rain, they're flooding fast. They've got the Historical Society archive stored down there. Sarah was instantly alert. Get the portable pumps and the water vac. I'll meet you there in 5. Ryan looked incredulous. You're leaving in the middle of this discussion for a flooded basement? Sarah grabbed her jacket. The Wilsons have the entire historical record of Millfield in their basement. Irreplaceable photographs, documents, the town's collective memory. So yes, I'm leaving. Jack, we'll finish this conversation later. Jack nodded, understanding. Go. I'll handle things here. 4 hours later, Sarah returned to the shop, soaking wet but triumphant. The Wilsons' basement had been pumped out, and the Historical Society archives had been relocated to dry ground with minimal damage. The entire operation had turned into a community effort, with neighbors forming a human chain to move boxes of documents to safety. She found Jack waiting in her office, alone. Ryan's gone back to Pittsburgh, he informed her. He's still angry, but he'll come around eventually, or he won't. Either way, the trust documents are being finalized by legal as we speak. Sarah sank into her chair, exhausted but relieved. So where does this leave us? Exactly where we were meant to be, Jack replied. Partners in something that matters. The training center will move forward. Riley's will continue to grow while staying true to your father's vision. And I'll keep my son away from Millfield until he develops a better appreciation for community values. What about Lambert and the missing funds? Already being addressed. Marcus is working with our audit team to trace every dollar. You'll have a full accounting by the end of the week, and any misused funds will be restored immediately. Sarah nodded, then finally asked the question that had been nagging at her. Why me, Jack? Out of all the mechanics who could have fixed your car that night, why did I deserve all this? Jack considered the question carefully. It wasn't about deserving, Sarah. It was about recognizing. In a world increasingly driven by algorithms and profit margins, you reminded me what business is supposed to be at its best. A way for people to serve each other, to build something meaningful together. He smiled. Your father taught you well. 1 year later, the grand opening of the Sullivan Riley Technical Institute drew a crowd that spilled out of the newly constructed building and into the adjacent parking lot. Local television stations sent reporters, and even the Pittsburgh papers had sent journalists to cover the innovative educational model being launched in Millfield. Sarah stood off to the side of the podium, watching as Jack Sullivan addressed the crowd. Behind them, the renovated Riley's Automotive Center gleamed in the summer sunshine, connected to the training institute by a covered walkway, symbolically linking the practical business with the educational mission. 1 year ago, Jack was saying, I broke down on a rainy night in Millfield. What I found wasn't just a skilled mechanic, but a reminder of how businesses can serve as anchors in their communities. Today, we're extending that vision by opening an institute that will train the next generation of skilled technicians, not just in automotive repair, but in the values of service, integrity, and community that define Riley's. The applause was enthusiastic, especially from the 20 students already enrolled in the Institute's inaugural class, all local young people who might otherwise have left Millfield for opportunities elsewhere. After the speeches and the ribbon cutting, Sarah found herself standing with Jack near the memorial plaque dedicated to her father. "He would have been proud," Jack said quietly. "Not just of the Institute, but of you, how you've grown this vision while staying true to your roots." "I keep expecting to wake up," Sarah admitted, "to be back in the leaking shop, drowning in bills, wondering how to keep the lights on for another month." "This isn't a dream," Jack assured her. "It's what happens when people of goodwill find each other and build something together." Ryan Sullivan appeared at his father's elbow, impeccably dressed as always, but notably more subdued than he'd been a year ago. His attempt to undermine the Millfield project had backfired spectacularly, resulting in his temporary reassignment to Summit's operations division, where he'd spent 6 months learning the business from the ground up. The governor's representative wants a word, he informed his father, then turned to Sarah with a nod that, while not warm, at least lacked its former condescension. "Impressive turnout." "Thank you for handling the equipment donations, Ryan," Sarah replied. His overseeing of the Technical Institute's equipment procurement had been Jack's way of giving his son a stake in the project's success. "The students are thrilled with the quality." After Jack and Ryan moved away to speak with the officials, Sarah found herself approached by Mike Donovan, who was now not just the sheriff, but also a member of the Community Trusts Board. "Who'd have thought," he said, gesturing at the crowd and the new building. "All because you fixed a broken-down car on a rainy night." "All because my father taught me that some things matter more than money," Sarah corrected. "Speaking of your dad," Mike said, "did you see who showed up?" He nodded toward the edge of the crowd, where elderly Mr. Peterson stood with a group of local farmers, all wearing their Sunday best for the occasion. Sarah made her way through the crowd to greet them. Mr. Peterson, approaching 90 now, took her hand in his weathered one. "Your daddy would bust his buttons seeing all this," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "He always said you were the best mechanic he'd ever trained. Turns out you're a pretty good business leader too." "I learned from the best," Sarah replied, thinking not just of her father but of Jack Sullivan and the unexpected partnership that had transformed not only Riley's but her entire understanding of what was possible. Later that evening, after the crowds had dispersed and the caterers had packed up, Sarah sat alone in her father's old chair, now placed in a corner of her office as a reminder of where she'd come from. The Institute was open, the shop was thriving, and the Community Trust was already exploring additional programs to support Millfield's sustainable growth. More importantly, the town had embraced the changes. The initial skepticism had given way to pride, as locals saw how the project was creating opportunities for young people to build careers without leaving home. Several shuttered businesses on Main Street had reopened to serve the increased traffic from the Institute, and property values had risen modestly, but not disruptively. Sarah picked up the framed photograph on her desk, her father standing proudly in front of Riley's auto repair on its opening day 30 years earlier. Next to it sat a new photo from today's ceremony: Sarah, Jack, and the first class of students in front of the Technical Institute. Two moments, separated by decades but connected by values that transcended time: service, integrity, community. Her father had built his legacy with a wrench in his hand and kindness in his heart. Now she was extending that legacy in ways he could never have imagined but would instantly have recognized. Outside, the summer twilight settled over Millfield. The town where she had been born had nearly lost everything and had ultimately found a way to honor the past while building the future. Sarah smiled, thinking of the long journey that had begun with a simple act of kindness on a rainy night when a stranger's car broke down and she decided to help, not knowing that in fixing his car, she was actually fixing her own broken dreams. In the grand scheme of things, maybe there were no coincidences, only opportunities to act with the same integrity in good times and bad. And sometimes, if you were lucky, those actions set in motion ripples that grew into waves, changing not just your life, but the lives of an entire community. Sarah turned off her office light and headed home, her heart full of gratitude for broken-down cars, rainy nights and second chances, and for the father who had taught her that the true measure of success wasn't what you accumulated, but what you gave away.